Yeah, thank you very much, Sarah. Hi, everyone. Yeah, thank you again for allowing me to speak at the conference. It's a pleasure to be involved in what is a great community, and it's forming some great engagement as well, which is fantastic. Um, so yeah, I'm Kieran. I'm a second year PhD student at the Camborne School of Mines in Cornwall, and also a research associate with Satala. And my general research area is in safety and sustainable development in small scale mining. So that's part of a wider European project called Impact, and it's developing a whole system solution for small scale mining. My role within that was to develop ideas around what we can do about maximizing our safety and sustainability with regards to this small scale paradigm. Um, but for today, in the context of responsible raw materials, I was going to talk about some of the research associated with this concept of cultural maturity and how we can link that to the environmental and social factors to help guide responsible practice. So yeah, I'll go into a bit about what the whole responsible extraction idea, looking at safety, culture, maturity in the mining industry, how those models have been developed, sharing structure and approach to develop this so-called environmental and social culture maturity and its associated criteria. So then you can use that to perhaps enhance your responsible practice through this structured guidance. So as we know, societal demand globally is placing pressure on the extractive industry to continue that sufficient supply of raw materials into the manufacturing sector. And the increasing rate of extraction is often at detriment to the environment and their local communities, particularly when things go wrong. And mineral reserves are often evaluated on their economic value, but you need to go beyond that and look at the social and environmental value of that reserve. So I'd say that more clarity is required for those operating companies on what they should be doing to be considered responsible. So the safety culture model is based on a 5-tier framework, which I'll go into in a minute. And basically I've adapted that to suit the criteria you might expect for environmental and social. So safety culture in general, basically past accidents in industry have motivated a lot of studies into the relationship between safety culture and the incidence of workplace accidents. So it's not just someone tripping and falling, it's like, why did they trip and fall? What was the leading root causes, the leading indicators associated with that particular incident taking place? So that safety culture refers to overriding perceptions of employees and management towards those safety issues. So you can define safety culture maturity of an organisation by their amount and quality of training, the effectiveness of communication related to health and safety, and the extent to which management take responsibility. So basically, the 5 models, 5-tier model there. So we've got the lowest level, pathological, basically is we don't care if we're not caught, but it then moves along up through each stage to ensure that you're meeting minimum requirements to have those systems in place, but then you start working your way even higher to saying that safety is how we do business around here. So you can say the maturity of an organisation's safety culture is a vital factor when considering how improvement measures will be implemented. And in this context, maturity refers to the ability of people to respond to those impacts appropriately whilst knowing how to act based on local circumstances. So basically trying to define this for safety culture as those assembly of characteristics and attitudes that establish a priority safety issues to receive the attention warranted by their significance. I'd say that socio-environmental culture similarly might be defined as the prevailing attitudes and perceptions of management. Employees towards occupational risks that have direct and indirect implications, localities, authorities, and ecosystems. So this is the model in question. Basically, it includes 4 tiers in this case, basically to prevent someone using this to take a middle ground approach to say, oh, we're doing the minimum requirement, you need to go one way or the other. And each tier outlines the expected characteristics of what a company or operation should be doing in terms of, in this case, the environmental policy, remediation, community integration, and impact assessment. So you've got the basic level where very few risk assessments performed, mitigation measures are very limited. But as you work your way through, you're starting to bring more of those standards into play, just going beyond compliance. bringing in schemes to help improve the environment up at the highest levels, building that mutual trust rather than relying on things going wrong to respond to it. Similarly with social culture, four tiers there. But again, it's in terms of social policy in this case, community relations, opportunities for employment, and perhaps the social impact assessment aspects as well. So just not really engaging in, well, in the lowest level, not really engaging in community employment aspects like that. But as you move your way forward up through the model, you've got those strong relationships being built throughout, maintained throughout the mine life into closure. The remediation work delivers beyond the expectation as well. And again, you've got that local employment coming through. So based on some reading into what the existing standards and principles out there that exist, such as IFC, ICMM, GRI, tried to glean some of the main factors that could define a company's environmental, social, culture maturity. Things like management assessment of impacts and risks, incident analysis, energy and resource management, waste and pollutant management, and biodiversity. In the case of social, things like CSR, SIA, community dialogue and employment and education, even conflict management, things like that. So looking at the environmental maturity criteria itself, so taking a few examples from environmental, basically the lowest level basic, where I've tried to define what a basic company would look like from that perspective of each factor. So as you work your way through some of those, the criteria starts to build up in to reflect the tier, basically. So there's those four tiers, and then the final one is basically the typical questions you might ask a person using this, a company or specialist using this model. What questions you'd be asking them in order to get the appropriate responses to fit somewhere on these tiers. So in my opinion, maybe using a tiered culture to assess and the existing maturity level of their company. And then from there, you can start to establish the improvement measures that are required based on the criteria in the higher tiers. So you can start to structure your strategy in certain areas going forward and start to prioritize it as well. So it's to enable management teams and extractive companies to self-assess their current approach to those socio-environmental issues and decide how and in what areas they may improve. So to summarize, currently I would say mineral reserves value mostly on the economic value. We need to also consider the environmental and social value, and adjusting the existing safety culture models and its structure to address those aspects may be a way to guide some aspects of responsible practice, particularly maybe small mines, which was what this was originally designed for. And the next steps be develop suitable maturity criteria for the social and perhaps even the governance considerations, so it's completely aligned with the existing ESG principles and structure. So thank you very much for listening. Happy to take questions, feedback on the models, their criteria, anything like that. So yeah, thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you very, very much, Keiran. And yes, as per usual, you can hear that fantastic applause coming through to you online. With this, and as per usual, we've got some fantastic chatter going on and good discussion that you have sparked with your presentation. So you mentioned that this has been designed for some of the perhaps the smaller operations or companies as a whole. Where do you think that you see differences in terms of what the smaller mining operations versus the larger mining operations should perhaps be looking for, or what kind of differences do they see?
In terms of the environmental and social performance?
Yeah.
Well, in terms of the small scale mining paradigm we're trying to develop with the project, the impact project, it's obviously been containerized a lot of the solutions. So in terms of the chemicals you might use, it depends on the processing techniques, but the quantities are reduced, and the quantities of water and energy requirements are reduced as well. So on the other hand, you've got a reduced workforce as well, and how much of that can be local when a lot of this needs specialist equipment specialist knowledge to run the equipment. So I think basically with that whole paradigm as well, it's a quick commissioning time. You need to react quickly. So it's about a hit the ground running approach, and this model allows you to see quickly where you sit in terms of your current approach, and then from there you can use that criteria to move yourself forward. And obviously it's designed to be easily digestible, so that those responses can be more quickly gleaned. So I hope that answers it.
Yeah, no, it does. Thank you very much, Keiran. And just, I guess, building on that, there's a question here that's come in from Alexander, and he's asking, what are the main environmental advantages of underground versus open pit mining based on your evaluations?
Yeah, good question. I mean, open pit, it's harder to keep a closed system, I guess. But it depends on the commodity and the processing techniques. Because, well, environmental, with underground, you can't then see the surface damage because that depends on the infrastructure at the surface. But in terms of open pit, that's very obvious, the scar left on the surface. So that's where the post-closure comes in you have to be quite careful about that. So, yeah.
Thanks for that, Keiran. Just, I guess, going back to maybe the first question and building on it a bit further, with regards to the models that you've put together here, are they ostensibly meant to be used for operations that are currently under operation? Or could you take the same frameworks and apply it, say, to exploration or to an operation that is going through closure, etc.? So can you take the same models and apply it to any stage in that value chain?
Ideally, yeah. I mean, that's where the different criteria comes in and those different factors. And that's where I want to look at all the stages and what factors come into play from an environmental and social and perhaps even governance perspective. So that you can look at it in different stages. And the earlier you start looking at this, the easier it is to implement the changes you need to make. But in terms of post-closure, there's aspects of the criteria in there regarding post-closure. And then, yeah, you can then start to, you can use it hopefully at any stage and be able to get some kind of improvement out of it. And that's the goal. Try and help improve the situation at a site, whether that's hit the ground running from the start of operations or whether you're reviewing your current performance over a period of time due to an auditor or something like that.
Great, thank you. Now, I know that you did touch on this towards the end of your talk, but what is next in your PhD? And I realise that COVID-19 is probably disrupting some of your plans as a whole. But what are you going to look for next when you, as you're completing your PhD?
Well, it will be trying to optimise these models so they cover more relevant criteria. And I guess going back to the safety side of things, there's aspects that can relate to health and safety here as well. So kind of refining the safety culture models for what is required in modern mining, even small scale. So I think that's where my direction is going at the moment, to be honest. So yeah, as I say, the email is there, so I'm open to feedback from people on these so far. And if you've got any other questions, feel free to drop me an email. Happy to answer things like that.
Thanks, Keiran. So final question, I promise, before we release you. And I mean, this, you almost have answered this with your previous answer, but maybe you want to build on it. And this comes in from Fiona, and she's asking, how is this being practically applied for small scale mining?
That was the next plan. So I had plans with my supervisor to arrange visits within the UK to study some mine sites and take this cultural maturity model to them so they could use it themselves and see if we can glean some improvement measures over a period of time through this structured guidance. So that is kind of the next step with this, I suppose, to test it. At this point, it's optimizing the criteria as far as I can.
Great, thank you very much, Keiran. And I mean, I think just to that as well, and maybe building on your answer back to Fiona here, I was recently, obviously before we were locked down, in the south of the Democratic Republic of Congo, and some of the artisanal miners there, I have to say that their attitude towards safety was far superior to perhaps the attitude and the culture that was being exhibited by some of the larger scale mining companies. So I think that whilst talking about maturity scales, etc., may feel like more of a larger organization type tool, it is very much present, I think, in far smaller operations as a whole. Keiran, I don't know if you want to add anything to that, just in final comments.
Yeah, it comes back to those attitudes, and that's where this criteria builds on the way it's worded. It's trying to build on the behaviours that you'd expect certain tiers, so they can kind of identify themselves based on what the criteria is telling them. So yeah, it's down to that management approach to safety and environment and social.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much, Keiran, and a massive round of applause from all of us on the other side of those microphones.